Well, good morning, second hour. So let's talk about what we're going to do this second week of American Lit. One thing I'd like to point out is many of you have not gotten in your week one handout. So please do that so you can stay caught up, have a good grade. So today, what you can expect. Today, I'll go over the checklist, the schedules, something called a CTA vote, and today's lesson is going to be on imagery. So if I was you, I would open up right meow the week two work so that when I start telling you what we're learning, you can put in your answers. We're also going to start reading our first work of the week, which is The Way to Rainy Mountain. I'll put the text on the screen so you can read along with me. Research shows that's the best way to accelerate your reading skills. So that's today. Tomorrow, going to prep for next week's quiz, going to show you what's on it and show you how to prepare for it. Also going to give you some additional resources to point out that can help you with either reviewing, studying, learning, or challenging yourself. And then finally tomorrow, I'm going to model some of the answers for your week two work so you can get that done and in. All right, so our checklist for this week, you're going to learn about imagery, and we're going to read The Way to Rainy Mountain, as well as prep for the quiz that's next week. All right, and as per usual, you'll be submitting all your work on one handout, and that's due Friday before midnight, even though we don't have school Friday due to registration. Another thing I'd like to point out about registration is that your form is going to be due to homeroom tomorrow. So get that done. Registration is really important because it helps us figure out as a school what our numbers are, and that includes our funding. So your teachers and everybody are going to be really pushing for you to get your registration done this week. Okay, just an overview of the Unit 1 schedule. Let's talk about CTAs. So if you've had me as a teacher before, you've seen these. CTA stands for Copeland True Life Adventure. These are just true, silly stories from my life. And I used to tell them all the time, but in hybrid, we had some classes that just weren't into it, didn't want to. And that's okay. I am game to do these or not. It's really up to you. So you folks are going to get to vote on your week two handout. There's just a box to check whether or not you would like a CTA told live in class every week. To inform your vote, I've also included, and you can see this on the slide, I've included examples of stories from YouTube. So you can watch those either to, like I said, inform your vote or just for funsies. CTAs are not graded. They're just meant to be two things, entertainment and examples for speech class. But you are more than welcome to have them as well. So that's what that means. So as you can see, I'm on the pink slide where your notes start. So at this point, I'm going to teach you about imagery so you can get that written down and learned. You very likely have encountered this before. Okay, so let's talk about imagery. There's a lot of definitions of imagery because it's a pretty important concept. I think the simplest definition is the one that's right here. So imagery is the author's use of language that appeals to the five senses. Another way you could write down an imagery definition is anything I can picture based on the author's words. Or you could write the author's descriptions create a picture. That's what imagery is. And here on this slide, you can see imagery is really important to reading because it's already part of how our mind works. So for example, anytime we read a word, our brain automatically starts to make pictures for it. It tries to make connections because the brain runs on patterns. So this is another reason why it's very important to read, because even though you haven't literally physically experienced the things that are happening in a book or in a reading, the brain, it doesn't make that distinction between experience and living. So the more you read, the more your brain knows about different experiences. And the more it can empathize with other people because you get different points of view. Another way to look at imagery is just by the five senses. And as you can see from the spelling on this particular image, I did grab this from a UK site. So the Brits, they spell it odors instead of odors. They add that extra U. Do you have to remember the different types of imagery? Like, Cope, am I going to have to remember the word olfactory imagery? No. I included this as just more examples to help you learn about imagery. Olfactory is just a really fancy way of saying sense of smell. So that's what imagery is. At this point, I want to switch over to your handout so we can get some of the answers on there. Let's make this bigger so you can see it. Right. So as always, every week you get a rubric that tells you exactly how you're going to be graded. So it's 10 points this week. This is formative. So the first thing I'll grade you on is does your work show an understanding of imagery and the way to Rainy Mountain, the story we'll read today? Do you have details and examples to show you understand? Second thing I'm grading you for is have you prepared, and we'll do this tomorrow, have you prepared for the first summative assessment, quiz 1, by completing prompts on this handout and or doing review? Instead of giving you a separate study guide for the quiz, I include them on these handouts. So you don't have to go chasing for that. So here is where you will vote whether or not you want a CTA told in class every week. Click yes or no. All right, so let's talk about imagery and the answer specifically. And just like last week, if you want to write down the answer I have here, you absolutely can. So the first question is, what is imagery? There's more than one correct definition. Choose the one that makes the most sense to you. So I just picked a simple one. I picked images created in my mind by the writer's details. And if you're looking for these examples later in the week, I typically post them at least by Friday. Like this handout with the answers, I post this at least by Friday in your green resources/examples folder on Schoology. If you haven't done week 1 yet, that would be a great place to start. Okay, number 2, give an example of imagery. So you can use one of the ones I showed you in class. So sense of smell, what's something you could smell? Or you could grab imagery from this week's reading, which we'll do in a moment, or from another work. All right. And I'm going to show you the resources slide in a moment here because it has more examples. So I just put all of the description at the start of The Way to Rainy Mountain, helps me picture the land of Mama Day's tribe. I, of course, wouldn't write that word for word if I was you because we haven't read Way to Rainy Mountain yet. All right. And then finally, for your preview, you're going to be asked, in your opinion, which work has the better use of imagery? World on the Turtle's Back from last week or The Way to Rainy Mountain in a moment here? And you're going to explain your reasons. So I thought The World on the Turtle's Back had better imagery. But again, this is opinion. It's hard to get it wrong. And the reasons why I think this is when I first heard this story on the res, it had excellent imagery with descriptive details. In fact, this was one of my favorite stories growing up because I could picture it so well. Okay, so I wanted to show you resources. So in your slides for this week, you have a blue slide like this, and it says optional resources. These are things you can click on to, like I said, learn more, review, or to challenge yourself. And I've even written which ones are for challenging yourself. So as you complete your work this week, these resources are available to you. Okay. So at this point, I want to get you started on our work for this week. Work is a fancy word for anything we're reading. Poetry, short story, book, what have you. So I want to get you started on N. Scott Momaday's book, The Way to Rainy Mountain. So we have an excerpt of it that just means a piece. So we're going to be reading the prologue, and the things you're going to be looking for are two main things: imagery and what creation stories or story is in this story. So I'll get you started. Like I said at the beginning, if you read along with me, That helps your reading skills. I'll get you started, and then you will have the rest of the time once I'm done reading here to work on this or finish up your week 1 and come back to this, however you want to do it. And as always, I'll stay in the meat. So if you have questions, I'll be right here. All right, so The Way to Rainy Mountain by N. Scott Momaday. A single knoll rises out of the plain in Oklahoma, north and west of the Wichita Range. For my people, the Kiowas, it is an old landmark, and they gave it the name Rainy Mountain. The hardest weather in the world is there. Winter brings blizzards, hot tornadic winds arise in the spring, and in summer the prairie is an anvil's edge. The grass turns brittle and brown, and it cracks beneath your feet. There are green belts along the rivers and creeks, linear groves of hickory and pecan, willow and witch hazel. At a distance in July or August, the steaming foliage seems almost to writhe in fire. Great green and yellow grasshoppers are everywhere in the tall grass, popping up like corn to sting the flesh, and tortoises crawl about on the red earth, going nowhere in the plenty of time. Loneliness is an aspect of the land. All things in the plain are isolate. There is no confusion of objects in the eye, but one hill or one tree or one man. To look upon that landscape in the early morning with the sun at your back is to lose the sense of proportion. Your imagination comes to life, and this, you think, is where creation was begun. I returned to Rainy Mountain in July. My grandmother had died in the spring, and I wanted to be at her grave. She had lived to be very old and at last infirm. Her only living daughter was with her when she died, and I was told that in death her face was that of a child. I like to think of her as a child. When she was born, the Kiowas were living the last great moment of their history. For more than 100 years, they had controlled the open range from the Smoky Hill River to the Red, from the headwaters of the Canadian to the fork of the Arkansas and Cimarron. In alliance with the Comanches, they had ruled the whole of the southern plains. War was their sacred business, and they were among the finest horsemen the world has ever known. But warfare for the Kiowas was preeminently a matter of disposition rather than survival, and they never understood the grim, unrelenting advance of the U.S. cavalry. When at last, divided and ill-provisioned, they were driven onto the staked plains in the cold rains of autumn, they fell into panic. In Palo Duro Canyon, they abandoned their crucial stores to pillage and had nothing then but their lives. In order to save themselves, they surrendered to the soldiers at Fort Sill and were imprisoned in the old stone corral that now stands as a military museum. My grandmother was spared the humiliation of these high gray walls by 8 or 10 years, but she must have known from birth the affliction of defeat, the dark brooding of old warriors. Her name was Aho, and she belonged to the last culture to evolve in North America. Her forebears came down from the high country in western Montana nearly 3 centuries ago. They were a mountain people, a mysterious tribe of hunters whose language has never been positively classified in any major group. In the late 17th century, they began a long migration to the south and east. It was a journey toward the dawn, and it led to a golden age. Along the way, the Kiowas were befriended by the Crows, who gave them the culture and religion of the plains. They acquired horses, and their ancient nomadic spirit was suddenly free of the ground. They acquired Taime, the sacred Sundance doll, from that moment the object and symbol of their worship, and so shared in the divinity of the sun. Not least, they acquired the sense of destiny, therefore courage and pride. When they entered upon the southern plains, they had been transformed. No longer were they slaves to the simple necessity of survival. They were a lordly and dangerous society of fighters and thieves, hunters and priests of the sun. According to their origin myth, they entered the world through a hollow log. From one point of view, their migration was the fruit of an old prophecy, for indeed they emerged from a sunless world. Although my grandmother lived out her long life in the shadow of Rainy Mountain, the immense landscape of the continental interior lay like memory in her blood. She could tell of the Crows, whom she had never seen, and of the Black Hills, where she had never been. I wanted to see in reality what she had seen more perfectly in the mind's eye, and traveled 1,500 miles to begin my pilgrimage. So as you continue reading here, he's going to tell you about what it was like to see the lands of his people. So I'm going to let you folks continue reading here. I wanted to get you into it. As always, if you have questions, join me on the meet. You got this.